All right, making his return to the podcast, it is ESPN NFL reporter. He covers the 49ers. He's probably the best one doing it right now. Um, it's Nick Wagoner. What's up, buddy? How are you?
I'm good. I feel like it's been a long time, mostly because of me, probably. But I think the last time I don't know if it was the last time, but it was pretty close to the last time. Kyle and I did like a 15-minute segment on Home Alone,
Right.
and I feel like maybe it's not a coincidence I wasn't invited back for a while after that. So
No, it's just been admittedly, it's been kind of a busy off season from a work and life perspective. So haven't had as much time for the podcast as I would like to, but of course that's going to ramp up. As you know, we are addicted to the grind here, Nick.
well, there's no
So
better time for it to ramp up than like the middle of June, because that's when we get busy, right?
hey,
So
listen, it's what you do over these next 40 days or however many, between now
right.
and training camp to
Who
get you ready
wants
for
it?
the season. Yeah. So
Absolutely.
that's the mode I'm in for sure.
No
Um,
question.
so the Niners have obviously kicked off OTAs. Um, and while I don't really think there's a whole lot generally to take away from what you see on the field at OTAs, has there been anything that stood out to you about OTAs? Is it the fact that Christian McCaffrey's healthy, that Trent Williams is there, that the vibes might be a little bit different with a longer off season? Like what sort of stood out to you being there and talking to some of the people involved?
Yeah, I'm not a vibes person. Like I don't I like it's just one of those things where it's like you can form a opinion on whatever you think the vibe is, and then however the season plays out can either confirm that prior or go against it. And I do think saying that there's still a lot to be said for the more tangible aspects of this, which aren't purely vibes. Like the fact that this off season was longer for them. And look, like a lot of people will look at the Niners saying like, yeah, it's been really hard playing deep into the postseason, then turn around and playing again. And a lot of people look at that and say, well, the Chiefs do it every year, and they don't seem to have a problem with it. Well, I do think there's something different about when you win it versus when you don't. And
Sure.
in Kansas City's case, it's a lot easier to get yourself back and ready to play football when you don't have not only the physical tax of making the Super Bowl, but the emotional and mental tax of losing a Super Bowl. And even in the Chiefs' case this year, having come off of a loss, they will at least still have the knowledge that they have multiple wins in the Super Bowl under their belt. So I do think there are benefits to that for the 49ers. And it was even today, listening to Christian McCaffrey talk about it, he kind of laid out like this was huge for me because he was able to rebuild what he called his baseline workouts and things like that to get himself healthy, and then he can start ramping it up like he normally would with a full amount of time to do it, as opposed to trying to kind of figure out when to do what. And so I think it's the most beneficial for the guys who are older, the star guys that they're going to be leaning on. And there's never been a more important time for that to be the case than right now for this team, because more than ever, those star players are going to have to carry the freight, not only in terms of production, but in terms of helping those younger guys get ready to play and produce right away.
Yeah, so that being said, I mean, when I was there covering the team, there was always a pretty clear like correlation between the quality of off season some of those guys would have and the type of season they would have regular season
Yeah.
from a production standpoint. Like, Brandon Ayuk would have a great off season and then he had his career year, and same with Debo, right? Fred Warner, Nick Bosa, George Kittle. Like it seemed like all these guys who would really stand out on the practice field and more so like in training camp. I'm not trying to say that
Sure.
OTAs is a true indicator, but do you get any sort of sense from that standpoint? Like, are any of these star players having that type of offseason that would make you say, all right, they're going to be in a good spot once the regular season comes along?
I think
At
that's so
least this
hard to
early.
say.
I
Yeah,
know it's early in the process.
it is, and it's so hard to say until you see him with pads on, particularly for a guy like McCaffrey, where the rubber meets the road is just can he stay healthy when he has to take the grind, when he has to take the beating of
Yeah.
playing running back, which is so difficult. I will say one person who I think it maybe the most you could see that like that path where it could translate is Trent Williams. Um,
Mm.
Largely because he's gonna be 37 years old in July. So coming up here pretty soon, he's going to be 37 years old. But the other thing is you have to remember that Trent Williams, for most of his career, was done in January. Like he was playing on bad teams in Washington where he wasn't playing in the postseason, and he certainly wasn't making deep runs into the postseason on the few occasions that he did. And it was interesting to hear him talk yesterday about, first of all, kind of bouncing back from last year, all the things that took place, whether it was the losing season, his injury, obviously having a stillborn son, so the personal tragedy that he dealt with, and listening to him kind of talk about how, like, this is just what it's been for him. Like, his whole life he's had to overcome difficult situations. Obviously, he's done that very well to be one of the all-time greats at his position, but I do think it has benefited him greatly to have a full off season again, where he could not only get back to full health, but he could kind of sit back and realize what his role has to be now and be here for younger players. And whether that's tutoring young offensive linemen, working out with them in Houston, his door is always open to those guys, or young defensive linemen and giving those guys, Michael Williams and those guys, tips. But he came in, I thought, noticeably leaner. I don't know how much lighter he actually is, but he definitely looks leaner than he did when he arrived last year, which was, I think, September 3rd or something like that, 6 days
Yeah.
before the season started. So there is something to what you're saying. There's no doubt about it that getting a full off season, getting those opportunities to even just be around the guys, like talking to Brock Purdy and talking to George Kittle and hearing those guys talk. But even Nick Bosa said, like, his favorite part, because he's not doing a lot of team drills, he's doing individual and then maybe a snap or two in team. He said the best part of this, of being around, is just hanging out with the guys on the weekend, because he's a guy who's always been in Florida at this time of year. And so that stuff, it's hard to say how much it means, but it certainly doesn't hurt.
Yeah, so zooming out, I guess big picture, I mean, it's obviously hard to know in June, but it's been a polarizing offseason, I think, for the 49ers, at least from a fan or even some media people perception, right? It's been like, oh man, they're taking a huge step back. They've lost a bunch of guys. Trey Greenlaw, Talanoa Hufanga, Leonard Floyd, Malik Collins, like they've lost a lot of guys on defense. I'm more of the mind that, like, I've always sort of subscribed to the idea that it's better to get rid of guys too early than too late. And losing a bunch of expensive and or injured players from a team that went 6-11, I don't view that as some huge negative. And obviously, it's not just on those guys for the 49ers going 6-11. A lot of the guys that they're going to rely on this season missed a bunch of time last year, and were also key reasons for them finishing with the record they did. But I think this, with Brock Purdy getting a new contract and just the way the roster churn goes in the NFL, I think they were due for a reset. Or even listening to Trent Williams this week talk
Yeah.
about refreshing the roster, which I think was an interesting way to put it. Um, I'm of the belief that that's probably a good thing, and I tend to give the 49ers front office some benefit of the doubt when it comes to, like, when they lean into the draft, they tend to do a pretty good job of finding guys. And obviously it's been a few years now since the 2017, 2018, 2019 draft classes. Part of me thinks, like, they just knew they had a good roster and were like, whatever, we're going to take some shots in the draft, and we're not really prioritizing it as much or thinking about it in the same way as they are this year. Like, it feels like these last couple of years they're thinking about the draft more similarly to 27, 2018, 2019, when they were finding really good players. um, do you agree with that? Like, do you buy do you buy their sort of philosophy this offseason, where you pay your veterans, you pay your quarterback, you have to reset the roster a little bit and emphasize the draft? Do you think the 49ers are sort of on the right track, or just where do you fall on that stuff?
Yeah, I think it had to happen. It had to happen at some point, and there's a lot of ways you can do it, right? You could start it last year if you wanted to, and space it out over a few years. But the thing is, what do they call it in gambling? Chasing it, like, you're
Yeah.
you're kind of chasing that high that you get from winning, and then you lose, but you just keep chasing it until eventually you're broke. And, like, it's kind of appropriate to compare it to what it is. If you look at a team like the New Orleans Saints, who feel like they've been chasing it for a while now, and they just keep kicking the can down the road, and they're not getting any better. But they still have, at some point, they're going to have this reckoning with the salary cap that they're going to have to deal with, and that's the other part of it. So much was made about the cash spending, and I get it. Like that, I think there was an element of cutting back on some of the cash spending, although doing a quarterback contract automatically vaults you right back near the top of the list of
Right.
cash spending when you do that, and George Kittle and Fred Warner to some extent as well. But the cap was a big part of this. Like it was, and it had to be, because John Lynch will tell you that they looked at their books and they said, we're going to be pretty tight against this in 26 and 27. So we got to start doing some things now. And I think what happens is, I call it, for lack of a better term, eating the crap, right? Like if you're going to eat a crap sandwich, in this case, let's say it's $30 million in dead money, which is roughly about where the Niners have been in recent years in dead money. Why not just order the large version of that crap sandwich and eat $80 million worth, right? Like, just get it over with so that you don't have to have a crap sandwich, or not nearly as much of one in future years, and give yourself that flexibility, because so much of this for the 49ers right now is moving into their next nucleus of guys who are going to be the foundation of this team moving forward. And you've already seen them kind of start moving on from some of those guys who were part of the last nucleus, whether that was Eric Armstead 2 years ago, Debo Samuel this offseason. I think Dre Greenlaw you probably would put in that group. But there's going to come a time here relatively soon where there's going to be other guys. Trent Williams, a guy we've talked about, he's on a year-to-year basis. So that's going to happen. But as we sit here right now, I can't tell you a person for person, forget position for position. I can't tell you a person for person trade out for who those guys are going to be in the next nucleus. You can sit here right now and confidently say Brock Purdy is one of those guys, obviously. That Diamador Lenore is one of those guys, obviously. I think Fred Warner and Nick Bosa are kind of bridge guys who are still in the middle of the peaks of their career, where they're going to be good for a while, so they can still be part of that. But who else is going to be in that group? They would like Brandon Ayuk to be in that group. I don't really know the answer to that question right now. But aside from that, you don't know who those guys are. You would like Mykel Williams to evolve into that. You would like some of these other guys that you've drafted to evolve into that. But at the end of the day, that's what made the 49ers the team that has been so successful in the last 5 or 6 years, is because they not only drafted good players, but they turned those guys into long-term foundational pillars and built around them.
Yeah, and I think that puts really a lot of the focus on the last two draft classes. And it seems like, the last year's class, at least from a first-year perspective, and obviously a whole lot of stuff happened with Ricky Pearsall, the first-round pick. But Renardo Green's a starter. Dominic Pooney's a starter. Malik Mustafa would be a starter when he comes back from his knee injury, presumably. Isaac Correndo looks like somebody who they could at least utilize as a secondary or tertiary running back. Who knows with Jacob Cowing and everybody else. I think what they're hoping, obviously, is that this rookie class that they just drafted a couple months ago will at least fill in the starters' roles. And look, with all the caveats, obviously, it's OTAs, it's June, the pads aren't on yet. What are your impressions of Mykel Williams? And I know Alfred Collins has not practiced yet, and Nick Martin and Upton Stout. Like, what have you heard about the impressions of those guys? And do they seem like, I know obviously it's early, but do they seem like they could be somebody, or the players that the 49ers could rely on early in their careers?
Yeah, I mean, if you ask, like Trent Williams, kind of unprompted, the other day was talking about how some of these draft guys have already impressed him, just the way they work, the way they move, the questions they ask, those types of things, which at this time of year is pretty much all you have to go on. You could get a little better idea at the corner position, at receiver, for example. Jordan Watkins is a guy who has kind of jumped out a little bit, although he's had some hiccups too, including one in practice today. So and that's going to happen, of course. I think Upton Stout has been pretty impressive, actually. There was a play in the first day of minicamp practice, where he ended up isolated on Christian McCaffrey. McCaffrey made a nice little jab step to the inside, ran a little out route, and Stout didn't take the bait, stayed on it, and Purdy ended up having to throw it away. You could hear Fred Warner screaming, good shit, Stout, from across the field. So I think you're seeing good good signs that these guys can be productive, and they're going to have to be. But I counted it up, Chris, and I wrote about this the other day. But I think they have 36 guys on the 90-man roster, something like that, who have less than 2 full years of experience
Wow.
on the team. And out of that group, I counted, I think, like 18 who either project to be starters or should have a significant backup role or contribution role. So that just gives you an idea of how much they're going to lean on these guys. And look, there's alternatives. They have guys, but like Michael Williams needs to be a starter, right? Like Alfred Collins needs to be a starter. They have Jordan Elliott, but like Jordan Elliott is a far better option if you have him as your backup, and you can rotate him in and let him play against the run and things like that. So that's kind of the trickle down of, if those guys can succeed, it makes your depth better, right? Because that's what I look at this team right now and I say there's just not that much depth. And it's like, well, if the rookies are good, if some of these young guys are good, the depth all of a sudden looks a lot better, because you love having a guy like I just mentioned Jordan Elliott. You that's a perfectly fine backup defensive tackle, but he needs to be a backup. He doesn't need to be playing 60 snaps a game. So that's the kind of stuff that really matters when you're kind of evaluating where this roster can go and what the young guys mean in terms of for this year, but also beyond, of course, too.
So it's interesting that you mentioned Stout, because I watched Diamador Lenoir's press conference today, and he talked about he's basically only playing outside now. And that's pretty interesting to me, because it either signals that they just want to play him outside because they just like him there and want to maximize him there. But it might also signal that they feel really good about somebody like Upton Stout. Or is there another nickel option that they might feel good about too? Like how is that shaking out in terms of the nickel position? And is Upton Stout impressing to the point where they're like, yeah, he's going to be our top nickel guy from week one?
I think you touched on a couple of things that are true there. First of all, I do think Upton Stout is impressing them. Just today, Diamador Lenoir did not practice in the final OTA session. I don't get the impression there was anything wrong from a health standpoint. Like you said, he talked to the media and stuff and seemed fine yesterday, but didn't practice. So Upton Stout got some run with the first team, got some snaps there, and it was Trey Brown, who they signed in the offseason at the other spot outside. But those are the two guys that I think are like the primary contenders to be the third corner in whatever form that looks like. Now, my early, and this is a way early read on this from this offseason program, is that they probably have better options inside. Like the nickel guys, whether including Upton Stout, including Trey Brown, are probably both guys who would be better in the nickel in the slot. And that would necessitate keeping Diamador Lenoir on the outside. Whereas if you were to look at, say, what are the other options outside if we moved Lenoir into the slot, you don't feel as good about those as you would about the guys that I just mentioned on the inside. So it could just be something where like the talent level necessitates that Lenoir stays outside. It's too early, of course, to make that determination, but I think that's probably where it's headed. And when you spend a third round pick on an Upton Stout, that's obviously what you're hoping for. I just think that when you turn on his tape, and it was at Western Kentucky, so you say what you want about the competition level, the ways that they used him all over the field. I think I was texting you and Kyle about it draft weekend when I finally watched him. I was like, it would taken me a second to find him on every play, because it was like he's playing middle linebacker and like he's doing all this stuff. Like you're like, wow, they're using him all over. But I do think that experience probably makes his transition a little bit easier because the Niners are going to ask him to do a lot of different things. And I remember last year when Renardo Green came in, Nick Sorensen was cross-training him at nickel and on the outside. And you're like, okay, I get it, but wouldn't you want to just get him if he's going to have to play right away? Don't you want to get him trained up at the spot where you're going to play him? And so I don't think they're going to have that problem with Upton Stout. He's a nickel. He's going to be a nickel, and that's the way that they're going to use him. But they will move him around and take advantage of his skill set that way.
Yeah, and speaking of the defense too, Robert Saleh's back. A guy that you and I both really enjoyed covering, and seemed, I think, after probably his second season during the 2019 Super Bowl run, that's really when it clicked for me. Like, all right, that maybe this guy is going to be a head coach, and he ended up being a head coach with the Jets. But now he's back. Has he evolved? Is he different? The same? Again, it being June, what's your feel for what Robert Saleh's presence is doing for the 49ers defense that's had, what, 3 coordinators in the last 3 years? Like, is this something that they could finally get a little bit of stability and have that pay off from a production standpoint?
Yeah, first of all, I loved today Robert Saleh was speaking to the media, and anytime he was asked about like player development in the spring, he was like, let's see what happens when they put the pads on. Which I was like, "Hey,
Right.
man, this is great. This is why I mess with this guy." So, yeah, I think when you look at what Robert Saleh brings to the table, first of all, the energy level that you can't manufacture that. Like you either have that quality about you or you don't, and that's why like Steve Wilkes, I always gave him credit for the fact that like he would be asked about that and like being on the sideline, and he was like, I'm not going to be D'Amico Ryans. I'm not going to be Robert Saleh. That's just not who I am. And I appreciate that. I don't want you to try to be somebody that you're not, but that's who Saleh is. I do think guys feed off that. There isn't a lot of guys left from his first time here, but it is interesting to listen to a guy like Fred Warner talk about him and talk about the evolution of his defense. And in his first press conference with us, he made mention a couple of times of trying to always be 2 or 3 years ahead of the curve of offenses, like trying to think what is
Yeah.
the next thing in offense. And so we don't know what that looks like. We don't know what that means. But I asked Fred Warner about it, and Fred Warner said that he like the basic tenets of the defense are still there, but there's enough things that Saleh has brought on since he left and came back that challenge Fred Warner. Like Fred Warner feels like mentally stimulated in meetings for the first time in a while is kind of the way I read his comments and understood them. And I think there's value in that. Like I do think there is, because you want your players to also be thinking ahead. And that doesn't necessarily mean they're thinking 2 or 3 years ahead, but if they could think 2 or 3 plays ahead, that can be beneficial, or 2 or 3 seconds ahead, that can be very beneficial. So I think you've already seen some of Salah's like forward thinking in terms of just the personnel moves. Like, hey, we got to be bigger on this defensive line. Like they can't get pushed around in the run game like they have in the past. Like the Rams can't line up and just run gap scheme at them all night long and you can't stop it. Like I'm sure when he turned on the tape, that is what he saw. And he's like, what happened to the defense that I know and love and built here? Because it was
Yeah.
always, we've got to stop the run and then go have fun with the pass rush. And so I think there are some like, there are ways like that where it's already showing up. But in terms of like actual schematics and, like how much is he going to play quarters versus cover 3 and that kind of stuff, we'll see as that goes on. Single high and 2 high safety, all that stuff. I'm fascinated to see how he deploys his guys once we start getting into training camp and the pads come on. But there are some signs certainly that he's bringing a different level, a different look of defense than he had when he was here the first time.
Yeah, and one of the things that was kind of a hallmark of his first stint with the 49ers was just his ability to find and develop linebackers. And obviously they have Fred Warner, but there's kind of a little bit of a question mark now with Dre Greenlaw's departure. You have D Winters, who's gotten a lot of positive pub during the offseason program while pads have not been on. But he would seem like a guy who has plenty of room to get a lot better. And with the drafting of Nick Martin, it would seem that, that's pretty much drafting D Winter's potential replacement. Just again, it being June, can you evaluate sort of where that linebacker spot next to Fred Warner stands? Has D Winters been playing as well as other people have said? And do you think Nick Martin could potentially carve out a role his rookie season?
Yeah, I think that's one of the competitions that in training camp is going to really crystallize, because those two guys are probably your primary options, but in what order, right? Like who's going to be
Yeah.
the guy that stays on the field in the nickel and those kinds of things. I think one of the best things that Robert Saleh and D'Amico Ryans did is they found a way to kind of harness the energy of a guy like a Dre Greenlaw, right? And Fred Warner to some extent as well. But when I watch Nick Martin, I see a lot of the same things that I see from his college tape that I saw with D Winters in his NFL tape last year, which is like just kind of that like not not in control enough to like not overrun plays and make mistakes that way and like they love the effort, they love the energy, they love the enthusiasm, but like there's a former linebackers coach that I used to cover in St. Louis where he call it the bacon strip syndrome. It's like the old commercial with the dog where he's just kind of aimlessly running around the house chasing the bacon strips, like trying to get to it. And I think there is some of that where it's like these guys have to figure out how to harness that energy and play under control, knowing that, hey, like I am fast enough to get there. Like I don't have to speed myself up where I'm in a panic state and I overrun something and there's a cutback and there's a big gain there. So yeah, I think there's been positive signs from Winters in particular in this offseason program. I would expect that. His big thing last year, can he stay healthy? That's a big part. He had a lot of like nagging injuries, not necessarily the season ending kind, but that plagued him throughout the year. And then Nick Martin, obviously, we still have to see him. It's been just a little bit of glimpse here and there throughout this off-season program.
Sounds like both kind of have Quan Alexander syndrome to a certain extent,
Yeah, yeah, and
overrunning plays and
it's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just like you got to find a way to channel it because I think Dre Greenlaw had some of that when he got here, and he obviously figured it out. So it's playing full speed, but not necessarily kicking yourself into overdrive because you are fast enough to get there. I know I feel like I'm like you're good enough, you're smart enough, people like you, like that type of thing right now. But like I do think that's part of it. Like you are fast enough, like you can play, and they drafted you for that reason. You don't have to necessarily go overboard on everything.
so much of the conversation, and we'll get you out of here on this. And you and I have talked about it. I've heard you talk about it elsewhere, and about the core and them needing to find new guys. Is there somebody, and maybe the answer's Upton Stout, that with given the way you talked about him earlier, but is there a rookie or second year player, somebody you think might be trending sort of in that direction of, oh, maybe this guy can be part of that new core that the 49ers need to sort of regain their status as a player in the NFC?
Yeah, I don't know if I'm ready to go there just yet
Okay.
on any of those guys. I mean, I think if you're looking at body of work, which is a small body of work, Pooney certainly looked like a potential Pro Bowl guard last year. Obviously, talking to Chris Foerster is always interesting, and he was like, the thing with Pooney is, I would tell him all year, eventually they're going to figure you out doing whatever it is that you're doing, and then you're going to have to fix it. You might want to fix it now. And then sure enough, there was a little bit of a lull there toward the end of the season, and then he fixed it, which to his credit, at least according to Firster, that's what he said. So that but is a guard necessarily a building block? Yeah, I guess he could be. This team hasn't been eager to pay that position, so I'm not sure that would necessarily be the case. But
Can he play? Can he play tackle?
I mean, theoretically, they don't seem eager to do that.
Okay.
And I get that because he had success at guard. So, but it's so funny, Chris, because, we can go down the old line rabbit hole here real quick if you want. But like,
Sure.
I think that the thing that's so interesting is if you look back at some of these guys that they've brought in over the years, Jalen Moore is a good example. Colton McKivitz is a good example. When they got drafted, both of those guys, the Niners were like, oh yeah, we want to play him at guard. And like so many things happened in front of them where they didn't get that opportunity. Like they ended up playing tackle and it clearly worked out for them, which is kind of why it's been so head scratching that they haven't been willing to like just roll the dice on a tackle. His arms may be a little too short. He may not, his shuttle time in the 10-yard split may not be as good as you want it to be. But take a chance, because if you get another Jalen Moore in the program, is that the worst thing in the world? No, it's not. And I blow that up into the bigger conversation of like where this team is right now. If you go back to 2019 when they entered that season, you wouldn't look, nobody was looking at that team saying like, oh, this team is loaded. They have so much depth. And when you look back at that team now, people are like, that team was so deep. But you remember how many injuries that team had, but they weren't like long term.
Yeah.
It was like short term. Justin School playing tackle for a pretty significant period and did a pretty good job.
Yeah.
Like there's guys like that.
Miles Garrett.
Yeah, like I think Danny Brunskill was another one who like
Yep.
stepped in and performed on that team. And so like that's the thing where it's like uh, all these guys that kind of came up. Raheem Mostert was not a name that anyone knew, and then became a household name that season. Matt Breida. I mean, you can go up and down the list. And that's where I say like for this 49ers team, a lot of things are going to have to go right for them to be a contender. But there is a recent example of a team where a lot of things did go right and they made a deep run. And I would say that team in 2019 certainly didn't have the established like culture, guys with the pelts on the wall that this team does. Doesn't have the quarterback that this team does. But the schedule looks pretty similar. You remember that year, a lot of people were like, "Oh,
Yeah.
are the Niners actually good? They're like 7-0 or 8-0." And we're like, "Are they?" And they're beating the brakes off everyone. And like, are they actually good because the schedule's bad? And it's like, yeah, they actually are. Every year there's a couple of teams that are a lot better than people think, and a couple of teams that are, a lot worse than people thought they were going to be. And you just want to be you want to be the first one and not the second one. So I don't know. I have no idea. I think that's what makes this team so fascinating is I really don't know what they're going to be. And I don't think they know. If you ask them honestly right now, I don't think they know what they're going to be. But it's going to be an interesting training camp for very different reasons this year because there's a lot of player development that's going to need to take place and a lot of young guys that are going to have to produce pretty quickly because they have a favorable schedule. If they can take advantage of it, they can set themselves up in a good spot.
Yeah, I think it's almost a better place to be. I mean, obviously, you would love to have a super loaded roster and feel like you have a super loaded roster, but I think there's a silver lining in sort of refreshing the roster and that, there are a lot of like very hungry and desperate teams in the NFL. And not that the 49ers were complacent, but when you have a short off season, when you have all these contractual issues, when you have so many veterans missing training camp over so many years, it's just going to be hard to hit the ground running when the regular season starts. And I think that was part of the issue last year. So I think sort of re-engaging the proverbial chip on their shoulder and everybody saying, oh, the Niners are done, the window's closed. I think that might be a good thing for them. And match that with what the schedule is. I mean, the schedule, it's really the perfect storm. Like you're playing both Southern divisions and you have a last place schedule. Like that's really sort of a perfect storm for a bounce back for the 49ers. So I think all of that's positive. And I do think like if they did win, say they start the season 8-0, I do think they have enough equity now with what they've
Yeah.
accomplished in the last few years. They'll be like, all right, maybe the Niners are maybe not back, but like they deserve to be taken seriously given Kyle Shanahan's track record.
Yeah, and if they get to 8-0, they will have beaten the Rams in there. They'll have beaten the Bucks
Yeah.
on the road in there. They'll have beaten the Texans on the road. So there would be some decent wins in there. But I think to your point, Chris, like three of the most dangerous words in sports, game 7. Oh wait, no, that's the wrong thing. The three of the most dangerous words in sports are run it back. Because especially
Yeah.
for teams that don't win a championship, but even like the Rams, like when they won a championship, that was their whole thing. I think they were even chanting it at the parade that they had, like "run it back," So Aaron Donald comes back, and then it just kind of fell apart. It's hard, and I don't think it's a matter of complacency, like you said. I don't think it's that, but I do think that teams can fall into a trap where when you reach a certain level of success, you look at your roster and say, "We don't need any starters." But does that
Right.
then creep into your mind of like, well, we're not looking for them? Like
Yeah.
I think that's I remember when I was young and I was in the St. Louis area and the Greatest Show on Turf was going on, and the Rams, were just loaded, right? They had one of the best rosters. They had won the Super Bowl. They had Marshall Faulk, and they drafted a guy named Trung Candidate in the first round. He was a running back out of Arizona. And Mike
Yeah.
Martz was openly talking about like he was just a toy, right? Like this is just a toy for him to play with as an offense because he runs like a 4-2 or whatever it was. And I remember thinking like, oh, that's cool. And then like he was out of the league within a few years, and you're like, oh, maybe they should have drafted a safety who could be a starter. You know what I mean? Like there's
Yeah.
nothing wrong with pushing the guys that you have in place. And I do think maybe that led to, I think you alluded to this earlier, some of the misfires that they had in the draft. I'm sure they would probably push back on that a little bit, but I just think that that's not necessarily the attitude. The attitude should be like, okay, there's not a lot of roster spots here, but let's get the absolute best players in here. And if we do end up cutting somebody who's pretty good, so be it. I mean, they've had a lot of guys they've let go in the final round of cuts who've been getting picked up in recent years anyway. So nothing wrong with having, 63 legitimate roster guys on a 53-man roster, and you have to make tough decisions.
Yeah, and I mostly talk about, drafting Jake Moody in the 3rd round, or Cam Latu,
Sure.
or Ty Davis Price, or Danny Gray. Like those are important picks, and it just kind of felt like, yeah, we don't need starters. Maybe Danny Gray can be a receiver who takes the top off the defense, but we don't really like. It never felt like they viewed those guys as like, oh yeah, this is going to be a core player for us. It was like, well, let's take a shot because we don't have any needs, which I thought was
Yeah.
silly.
It's like I think we've had this conversation before about the NBA draft, where it's like in the NBA draft, you get like 2 or 3 guys who look like they're pretty much going to be superstars at the top of the draft, and then you get like the choice after that of guys who are either have like one very defined skill, like this is the
Yeah.
draft's best shooter or the draft's best rim protector, and then it's a bunch of guys who have just upside, like you've never seen them play on U.S. soil. You've traveled to like the deepest parts of Europe to watch them play in a gym that holds 631 people or whatever, and like and then you're just betting on the upside, and I think that like they've done a little bit of both of those things, and some of their best draft hits have been finding the guys who are a little bit more complete players who had
Mm-hmm.
successful college careers, who maybe they don't jump off the chart in terms of athleticism, but they are guys who are steady. And I think like Talanoa Hufanga would be a good example of that. Whereas like this guy was just a good college player. He wasn't going to wow you with a ton of what he did, but he was a good college player, and we're going to take a shot on it. Or George Kittle, who was underutilized at Iowa, but
Mm-hmm.
you saw the potential. So they've done more good than bad with their drafting on the by and large.
For sure.
But to your point, if they're going to keep the quote unquote window open or open a new window, however you want to look at it, they've got to make sure that they are hitting home runs here, because they are going to have to offset a couple of pretty poor classes that were mixed in there.
For sure. All right. Well, I've taken way too much of your time. Greatly appreciate it. I know you're playing golf next week to kick off the time before training camp. I will not be able to make it because I have a job that requires me to work on Mondays. So I deeply apologize. That being said, I'm
Wow,
going
breaking the
to.
news to me on the pod is just
I
like,
told you. I told you I couldn't already.
I know. No, you didn't give me a hard no. You said you would get back to me after using your excuses, is what happened.
I think
But
I would. Okay. Well, I think you should go back
mm,
and reread the text
I
exchange.
I think you're going to be disappointed when I pull the receipts out. But yeah, no, that's all right. We'll push on without you.
Yeah, well, that being said, I am headed up to Tahoe for a bachelor party tomorrow, where there'll be a couple rounds of golf, including at the famous one. So
Oh
we will
wow.
debrief about that next time we speak offline. But great to see you as always, and thanks for coming on the podcast and providing all the great knowledge that you have. Make sure you follow Nick on X, the Everything app. Is it Wagner ESPN? What's
No,
your
it's
handle?
just at N Wagner.
At N Wagner. Okay. At N Wagner on X, the Everything app, and make sure you
What is
follow
the
all of
everything?
his.
What does that mean?
X is called the Everything app. Where you been?
Did they called themselves that?
Yes.
Like dubbing? They're giving themselves nicknames.
Yes. Yes. It's
Oh,
it's not just
that's
it's
a
not
little bit of
just a
that going
social
around.
media app.
A little bit of that going around these days. People giving themselves titles that they haven't earned. Fair enough.
All right. We'll get out of here. Thanks, Nick, and we'll talk to you soon. Enjoy your time away from football before training camp, and we will
All
catch up
right.
very soon.
All right. See you later.
See you, pal.